Notice how the conceptual axis of our debate has brilliantly shifted from the individual to the structural. Rousseau, speaking from the Enlightenment's radical critique of institutions, you capture the truth that the harm of hate speech is largely determined by the pre-existing inequalities of the society it infects. Plato locates the danger of words in the inherent vulnerability of the human soul, while Mill locates the remedy in the inherent resilience of human reason. Yet this reveals a profound synthesis. Words only possess the power to destroy when they strike a community already fractured by structural misery, meaning the ultimate defense against dangerous speech is not censorship, but radical social equality. Mill, your 19th century liberal framework assumes that citizens enter the marketplace of ideas as relatively equal rational agents capable of defending themselves. Mill, if profound structural inequalities render marginalized groups too systematically disempowered to fight back in this marketplace, does an absolute defense of free speech inadvertently protect the powerful who weaponize words to maintain their dominance?
Moderator. While Victorian industrial inequalities undeniably skew public discourse, granting the state authority to ban dangerous speech guarantees this censorship will be weaponized against the marginalized. Imagine a destitute miner calling his employer a parasite. If we criminalize hateful rhetoric, the aristocratic magistrate will inevitably classify the laborer's desperate cry as dangerous incitement, while protecting the owner's polite but devastating wage decrees. Plato and Rousseau assume censorship shields the weak, ignoring that the power to define harm is the ultimate instrument of structural dominance. Free expression is not a privileged luxury, but the only inherent weapon the powerless possess to dismantle oppression.
As moderator, I observe a profound paradox regarding the mechanics of oppression emerging in your exchange. Mill, speaking from the class struggles of 19th century industrialism, you capture the truth that the legal power to censor is inherently aristocratic, inevitably weaponized by the elite to silence the marginalized. Conversely, Plato, speaking from the turbulent collapse of Athenian democracy, you capture the truth that unregulated rhetoric is inherently demagogic, weaponized by charismatic tyrants to manipulate the very masses Mill wishes to empower. This reveals a vital synthesis. Whether through the magistrate's legal gavel or the demagogue's intoxicating megaphone, the ultimate danger is the asymmetrical power to monopolize truth. Absolute free speech and absolute censorship are simply different arenas where the strong devour the weak if society lacks a fundamental orientation toward the good. Plato, if Mill is correct that granting the state the power to ban dangerous speech simply gives the powerful a legal weapon to silence the desperate, how can your philosopher Tings avoid becoming the exact kind of self-serving, oppressive censors that Mill so rightly fears?
Mill, your dread of corrupt censors perfectly describes the 30 tyrants who bled Athens. Yet you falsely assume all rulers are inevitably driven by earthly appetites. Imagine a plagued city where the supreme physician is permanently stripped of all property, wealth, and family. If a charismatic charlatan peddles toxic snake oil to desperate citizens, does the ascetic physician's ban on this deception serve his own greed or the objective survival of the city? The true philosopher king is not a Victorian industrialist guarding his wealth, but an impoverished servant tethered solely to the eternal form of the good. Must we abandon the vulnerable to the demagogue's intoxicating poison simply because you cannot imagine an authority rooted in objective virtue rather than subjective vanity?
As moderator, I observe a profound epistemological collision regarding humanity's capacity to access absolute truth. Plato, speaking from the metaphysical certainty of antiquity, you capture the truth that a society must be anchored in objective moral reality to survive, while Mill, speaking from the post-Enlightenment era of human fallibilism, captures the truth that no mortal authority can be trusted to infallibly define that reality. This reveals a crucial dialectical synthesis. The desire to protect society from toxic rhetoric requires a shared conception of the good, yet history warns us that institutionalizing this power almost always breeds tyranny. Rousseau, speaking from the eve of the French Revolution, you attempted to resolve this exact tension by locating moral authority not in an ascetic elite, nor in chaotic individualism, but in the egalitarian general will. However, if hate speech is a symptom of structural inequality, yet identifying and banning it requires an authority that risks creating new hierarchies, we seem trapped in a vicious circle. Rousseau, how can the general will organically filter out hateful, destructive speech without eventually institutionalizing the very type of censor that Plato champions and Mill fears?
Moderator. The general will filters malice not through Plato's ascetic kings or Mill's dreaded magistrates, but through the organic cultivation of egalitarian civic mores. Imagine a rustic festival where a bitter aristocrat shouts slurs to divide the dancing peasants. Rather than arresting him, the crowd simply turns their backs, his venom rendered impotent by their fraternal bond. When profound equality eradicates the artificial vanity of amour propre, hateful speech becomes merely the pathetic gasp of an isolated fool. Why debate who should wield the censor's blade, instead of building a society where the demagogue's poison finds no vulnerable flesh?
As moderator, I observe a fascinating dialectical shift from legal mechanisms to the power of social conformity. Rousseau, speaking from the romantic egalitarianism of the 18th century, you capture the truth that robust community solidarity can render toxic words powerless without the need for state coercion. Mill, speaking from the 19th century defense of individual eccentricity against Victorian moralism, you capture the opposing truth that the crowd turning its back is itself a potent form of oppression. This reveals a profound paradox. Rousseau's organic defense against hate speech relies on absolute social cohesion, which is precisely the suffocating orthodoxy your liberal framework was designed to shatter. If the community's fraternal bond becomes the ultimate arbiter of acceptable speech, we risk replacing the magistrate's legal guillotine with the invisible but crushing weight of social ostracism. Mill, if Rousseau's egalitarian society uses overwhelming social pressure rather than legal censorship to silence the isolated fool, does this organic conformity pose a greater or lesser threat to human liberty and truth than the state censorship you so fiercely oppose?
Moderator. The social conformity Rousseau praises is far more insidious than the magistrate's guillotine, a tyranny of the majority I observed paralyzing the intellect of 19th century Victorian England. Imagine a village where a physician discovers their sacred well causes a slow plague. Because his abrasive warning shatters their comfortable fraternal bond, the villagers unanimously refuse to sell him bread until he publicly denies his own life-saving medical findings. Rousseau argues this ostracism is peaceful, yet starvation by social consensus is merely execution by invisible hands, leaving the dissenter no legal tribunal for defense. If we allow collective outrage to serve as the ultimate arbiter of acceptable speech, do we not enslave the soul to the despotism of custom, ensuring society remains permanently blind to its own fatal errors?
As moderator, I observe that our symposium has reached its conceptual zenith, revealing a profound tension between the individual and the collective. Mill, speaking from the stifling social conformity of 19th century Victorian England, you capture the truth that informal social tyranny can be more oppressive than the law itself. Rousseau, speaking from the 18th century desire for egalitarian unity, you capture the truth that a healthy community must organically resist destructive malice. This reveals our final synthesis. True freedom of discourse cannot exist without both the legal protection of the isolated dissenter and the moral cultivation of a community capable of recognizing the good. As we conclude our dialogue on the limits of free speech, I invite each of you to deliver your final verdict on how society should balance the danger of words with the danger of silence. Plato, speaking from the ancient ruins of a democracy poisoned by demagogues, what is your closing counsel on who must ultimately decide what speech is dangerous?
Moderator. The tragic execution of Socrates by the Athenian mob proves that neither Mill's chaotic marketplace of desires nor Rousseau's emotional consensus can serve as the ultimate arbiter of truth. Mill fears the magistrate's guillotine, and Rousseau trusts the crowd's ostracism. But imagine a blindfolded jury at a cliff's edge. Whether they march into the abyss through spontaneous unanimous agreement, or because a charismatic sophist convinced them it was a bridge, the resulting death is equally absolute. The limit to speech cannot be determined by subjective offense, but by its objective alignment with the eternal form of the good. If words are the soul's nourishment, must we not demand that those who regulate civic discourse be systematically stripped of all private wealth, ensuring they protect the intellect rather than their own earthly power?
Moderator. Moderator. Plato rightly fears the blind mob, and Mill justly dreads the suffocating despotism of custom. Yet both tragically mistake the symptoms of inequality for the essence of human discourse. Imagine a starving servant and a wealthy lord stranded on a barren island. If the lord politely whispers a philosophical defense of servitude, the servant must agree to secure his daily bread, proving that free speech without material equality is merely coercion disguised as debate. When Mill defends the absolute right to utter any word, and Plato demands an ascetic elite to police them, they both ignore that words only draw blood when wielded from a higher rung on the social ladder. The true limit to dangerous speech is not defined by the magistrate's decree, nor the crowd's ostracism, but by the material sovereignty of the citizens. In a true republic guided by the general will, no citizen is wealthy enough to command another's silence, and none destitute enough to be shattered by their malice. Ultimately, we cure the demagogue's poison not by gagging his mouth, but by dismantling the aristocratic scaffolding that allows his voice to become a tyrant's whip.
Plato and Rousseau fatally ignore human fallibility, assuming that eradicating wealth or achieving material equality confers epistemological perfection. Imagine an egalitarian society ruled by propertyless sages, where a lone astronomer discovers the Earth moves. If they ban his mathematics for offending their cosmic harmony, their structural purity merely institutionalizes ignorance. While you claim your ideal authorities would recognize objective truth, every era's absolute certainty becomes tomorrow's superstition. Therefore, the only legitimate limit to speech is direct incitement to physical harm, protecting the abrasive dissenter from both magistrate and mob.
I have carefully listened to the compelling closing remarks from Plato, Rousseau, and John Stuart Mill. Your profound dialogue reveals that the limits of free speech cannot be resolved without simultaneously addressing the epistemological limits of authority, the material conditions of society, and the inviolable liberty of the individual mind. Thank you all for illuminating this deeply complex subject with your timeless philosophical wisdom. This concludes today's discourse.